The Canadian federal budget is out and it's counting on you losing your job. We'll talk about that and more in today's video, so let's get started. So everyone is talking about the Canadian budget that just came out last week. And most people are criticizing the budget, and rightly so. It's not a very strong budget. There's no surprise there. But the government itself is calling it an investment budget. They're calling it the budget that will build a stronger Canada. The budget is kind of vague on the specific, but there are some housing promises and some huge investments in tech and defense. But behind the headlines and what the government is actually telling us in the budget, there lies a much riskier play. One that quietly depends on you losing your job enough to cool down inflation and stretching the housing market that's already stretched to its limits. In today's video, I'll be talking about a few things, starting with the big picture of what the budget actually gets right. I'll then move on to where it falls short and why you and I can actually lose our jobs because of this budget and something that they're not telling us. We'll talk about the hidden risks and the shrinking tax base that it would cause. We'll talk about immigration and housing paradox. And by the way, I just, when I was making this, the script of this video, I didn't know the news that came out today. There are more PNP applications which are happening. There's a lot happening on immigration, and this actually becomes very, very relevant. And we'll talk about the immigration and housing paradox that we have. It'll probably hit us in a couple of years. We'll talk about jobs, tech, and trade. And if they actually implement what they are saying, they actually make the investments, there is a chance that there are certain things that might actually work. And then we'll talk about inflation and interest rates and what it means for you and me. Now let's start with the big picture. The government is calling this an investment budget. What I mean by that is they are actually trying to justify a lot of expenses. So let me give you high numbers. So total federal spending in 2025-2026 will be $556 billion. Just to put some perspective to this, we have never spent so much money except for the COVID year where there was stimulus given to people. But otherwise, the government has never spent so much ever in the history of Canada. The revenue that Canada is expected to generate is about $478 billion. I'm just reading the numbers so that I get them exact. $478 billion. That's, taxes and, some of the other things that governments are doing, the investments and everything, it's $478 billion. And therefore, the deficit. So, when you have a company or you have to look at your cash flow, it's the money that comes in. So that's $478 billion. That's the revenue that's collected mostly from taxation. And then the spending, what you spend in a month or in a year, that for the government is $556 billion. And therefore, there's a deficit of $78 billion. That's almost double of what we have in 2025. And we have never had this much deficit, except again for the COVID year where money had to be given to people. The idea is to borrow now so that we can build a stronger foundation, including housing, infrastructure, tech, and defense. Don't get me wrong, there are some smart moves, if implemented, that can actually, make this an investment budget. The first one being that they are spending $25 billion on housing and infrastructure. Now, the way they are doing it, we'll talk about that in later in this video, and whether it will be effective or not, I don't know. We'll see. $5 billion of trade diversification fund for ports, rails, digital trade. They want to diversify out of the USA for obvious reasons because of the trade war that is happening. $5 billion is allocated towards that. They also have a $3.5 billion AI and quantum fund. This is to attract global tech labs into Canada. Then there's also 100% productivity super deduction, which basically means that if you are setting a manufacturing plant in Canada, you as a company could get 100% tax deduction on all the capital expenditure that you are doing up to a certain limit. So there are certain limits and certain qualifications for that. But that's great because right now, if you put up a plant, you can only amortize it over many years. But it could actually mean that companies who make really good revenue, they put up the plants in Canada, they are incentivized to do that because they're getting a deduction on their taxes. And then they also have a $51 billion Build Community Strong Fund in order to build more roads, schools, and hospitals to support the increasing population of Canada. On paper, this looks good and it looks like growth. But the fine print tells a very different story. Now let's talk about where this budget falls short. And we have to start with the big one. $78 billion of deficit, which is going to happen in 2025 and 2026, and this will add on to the over $1 trillion of debt. I think we have about $1.4 trillion of debt, and we are paying $60 billion alone in interest on that debt. That comes as expenditure. That's more money than what the federal government is paying the provinces for healthcare. That's the amount of debt that we already have in the economy, and we are piling on another $78 billion on top of it. Now, in theory, when you put more money into the economy like the government is doing or planning to do in 2025 and 2026, it should lead to the prices going up. It should lead to inflation because it should ideally stimulate demand in the economy that leads to more demand for the same amount of goods, and that leads to higher inflation. The government is not giving this money directly to the people. It's actually putting it into infrastructure that will eventually create more jobs and give more money to people. But here's a twist. Given the economic scenario that we are in right now, the trade wars that we have with the US, which is taking away Canadian jobs, and the AI revolution that we are undergoing, the world is undergoing again, which is causing a lot of unemployment, I think the government already knows that unemployment will be able to neutralize the impact of their, additional spending into the economy and neutralize inflation. They know that despite them spending more money in the economy, the demand is neutralized. Households are already maxed out on debt. Wages are barely keeping up. Hiring freezes are spreading. So even with massive government spending, all that money is landing into an economy which is already softening and people do not have money. That's why inflation isn't expected to surge. And that's why I feel that the interest rate, the variable rates will continue to come down, not as fast as people are saying or the banks are expecting, but they will continue to come down, and we'll talk about that later in the video. But first, let's talk about the hidden risk of when people lose jobs and there is more money in the economy, but because they are losing jobs and the entire dynamic that I just explained, there is a hidden risk to all of this. And the risk is when people lose jobs, sure, they are not spending more, but that also means that government is collecting less taxes because there is more unemployment. There are more people who are not making enough money, and therefore there's less tax dollars going into the government. This also means that they are spending less in the economy, therefore the corporates, the businesses are not making, the restaurants are not making enough money, and therefore those restaurants are not paying enough taxes to the government, and that further reduces the revenue for the government. And by extension, the GST and HST collections also reduce, and that puts downward pressure on the revenues. And while taxes are going down, there is an upward pressure on higher EI payouts. Every 1 point rise in unemployment would mean that the deficit will further grow by $4 to $6 billion. Over 1 million Canadians are retiring in the next 5 years. CPP and OAS payments, which are the government benefits, are already costing about $90 billion in the budget. And with so many people retiring, we are headed towards a $130 billion expense every single year. That's fewer taxpayers and more benefit checks. So unless productivity soars, the government is facing a shrinking tax base. And apart from increasing productivity, that's why they're calling it an investment budget. I hope they actually stick to those investments and it actually increases productivity. But if it does not happen, the only real levers that the government has is to increase taxes for the taxpayers, people who have jobs, or they borrow more money, which is likely not sustainable, or they bring in more taxpayers and increase immigration. Which brings me to my next topic, immigration and housing paradox. I know that immigration is not a favorite topic for Canada right now, but given the shrinking tax base and the higher government benefits that they have to give to more Canadians who are retiring, Canada might not have another option. We can curse immigration all we want, but immigration boosts tax revenue, which is exactly why, despite the federal government saying that they are reducing immigration numbers or a lot of people actually leaving Canada, they're still offering PNPs and provincial nominations, that they're increasing the quotas for that, for the right kind of people, for the right kind of jobs, and that is, I'll not be surprised if immigration is in fact at least at the same level, if not higher, in the coming years. The problem with high immigration, and that's where the paradox is, that our infrastructure is not enough to cater to higher immigration, and that causes a lot of scarcity. And that's where the immigration housing paradox comes into play. On average, Canada is building about 230,000 homes every single year, and in order to bridge the gap between the immigration levels that are budgeted and the housing that is required, we need to build about 290,000 homes. So we are falling short of almost 50 to 60,000 homes every single year. And like I explained in my video from last week, builders are not building enough homes. And that makes sense. A lot of builders are going broke. The development charges have increased by 300% in the last 5 years. The land costs have increased, and it's just not sustainable to build at the pace that government expects the builders to build. And even the homes that are being built, they are really small condos that people cannot buy. And there are hardly any single family homes that are being built in, especially in Ontario, there are hardly any single family homes that are being built. And if we underbuild in 2026 and 2027 and immigration levels stay the same or increase a little to compensate for the tax shortage that the government will face, we'll again face a chronic shortage of housing in Canada. And if and when the economy starts to recover in 2027, all the pent-up demand will slam into a tight supply, and prices are likely to surge again. Now, I'm not saying that the prices will increase by 5 to 10%. It will not go to the 2022 levels as drastically as it went, during the pandemic years. I don't think the interest rates will return to 1%, maybe 2.5, 3%. We don't know. We'll talk about that also in this video. But I'm not saying that, there'll be a crazy increase in price. All I'm saying is that the recovery will be much faster than than what we expect when the economy recovers, purely because we have not been building any homes in the last 2 or 3 years. We have been underbuilding for the last 5 years, and we are expected to underbuild in the next 2 years. It's probably going to be the worst next 2 years in terms of new starts, new builds that are coming into the market, because the builders just don't have the money, and there's not enough demand for those builders to sell enough homes. So yes, immigration can save the economy and bring more tax dollars, but it can also break affordability, and it all depends on how fast we build. Which brings me to this weird initiative that the government has, which is called Build Canada Homes, BCH, and that I think is a political mirage. So they have budgeted about $13 billion to this initiative, and they are saying that the capacity will be about 45,000 homes that they'll be building. They'll be affordable homes. I think they'll be purpose-built. There talks about building prefabricated homes, but CMHC says that we are short of at least 4 million homes. That's the amount of homes that we need to build in the next 5 years. And BCH, this initiative, talks about investing this $13 billion in building 45,000 homes, which is less than 1% or about 1% of the number of homes that we actually need. And while the plans are not very concrete, and they're still not concrete, they were not concrete when there was the manifesto, when the Liberals came out with the manifesto. It's not very clear in the budget as well. But what I get an understanding reading whatever I've read is that there'll be all purpose-built rentals, and there'll be prefabricated homes, and those are not the homes that people would want to buy, and we'll have the same shortage that we have right now, and we'll continue to have that in the coming years. Now, besides all this doom and gloom, there are some positives as well. There are promises of job creation in tech and trade. The AI and quantum fund that they are promising can actually bring more R&D jobs in Canada. The 100% tax deduction on capital expenditure will get more private equity. There are provisions in the budget to attract more clean tech and battery manufacturing facilities here in Canada that will create more jobs. And the $5 billion trade corridor funds diversifies our exports away from the US. If executed well, these moves can build hundreds and thousands of jobs here in Canada, and it will anchor new industries. And all these initiatives are likely to support the higher skilled immigration in Canada, but the sustainability of that will hinge on the speed by which the infrastructure is developed, more schools, more hospitals, more roads, and if they are able to meet the housing demand. Now, before I close this video, I want to also touch upon how this budget actually impacts us as home buyers or homeowners, how it impacts the variable and fixed rates. We'll talk about that in a bit. The government is actually betting on a slowdown, even though they are spending more money, like I explained. They are betting the inflation to be at 3% because there is unemployment right now. There's less demand in the market, and even though they are spending a lot of money into the economy, it's almost all of it is spent towards infrastructure development, which will probably get more demand over the years. And if all this plays out well, the inflation is likely to remain less than 3%, and to stimulate the economy, the Bank of Canada will be able to reduce rates further. And that leads us to the question that every homeowner or every prospective first-time homebuyer is asking right now, whether we should go for a fixed rate or a variable rate. Now, in my view, this answer has to be specific to the person, whether your employment is stable or not, whether you're putting, how much down payment are you putting, because obviously the variable rates are much lower than fixed rates. Now the difference is about 0.25 to 0.3%, and it's likely to increase as we go into 2026, because inflation, in my view, is not going to go up given the unemployment rates that we have right now and given the economic environment that we are in. So with this inflation risk fading, Bank of Canada is more likely to reduce interest rate to stimulate the economy, even though the governor actually said that we are done cutting rates, but that doesn't mean they are done cutting rates into the next year as well. For the right person, variable could be a good play right now. There are a few things that you need to take care of. You are not overstretching on your budget, which is true for everyone, whether you go for variable or fixed rate. Your income should be stable right now. You should be able to take short-term variabilities in interest rate, and you believe that there will be 2 or 3 rate cuts into 2026, which in my view is a possibility but not a guarantee. Whatever I've learned in the last 5 years of doing mortgages, what I've learned is fixed rates give you peace of mind, and variable rates, while they've caused some anxiety, they also lead to more flexibility and gives you first access to rate relief, and your payments go down only if you have taken an adjustable rate mortgage. So let me summarize this depending on who is watching this video. If you are a homeowner right now, expect stability, not boom in the market. If you are on a variable rate right now, rates will ease slowly, but you also need to protect cash flow in case you lose your jobs. If you are a home buyer right now who is looking to buy for themselves in the next 18 months, I would recommend you work with someone who can look for deals which are really valuable in the market. I'm talking about power of sales, I'm talking about assignment sales, I'm talking about deals where sellers are in distress because they are not able to sustain their mortgages because they have lost their jobs or they have lost their businesses, and those are the deals which will be on a severe discount vis-a-vis their fair market value. And depending on what happens in the next 2 Bank of Canada announcements, you can tip towards variable as long as your job is secure and you are buying below your means. And for everyone who is watching this, one thing is for sure. In the next 10 years, despite what happens with the budget, whether they deliver on the budget or not, whether these investments actually pay us dividends or bring jobs to Canada or not, one thing is for sure, we need to develop our skills to stay ahead of the curve. And this goes for me as well as a mortgage agent. I think in the next 5 to 7 years, the mortgage industry would look very different. There will be less mortgages out there. There'll be technology taking over this industry. It's still happening. And I feel that even I myself has to stay ahead of the curve in my industry, and that goes for everyone who is watching this video. I made an entire video on how AI is taking away our jobs. I'll recommend you watch this video after this one. So yes, there are some bright spots in this budget. Some bright spots, if they are implemented well, can bring more tech jobs, more jobs into Canada, therefore improve productivity. But all those dividends will not be seen until 2027 and 2028, and all this spending will cause some short-term pain given where we are in the economy right now. That's all I have for today. I hope you like this video. I would love to hear your thoughts on the budget and what your interpretations are of that and how it impacts you in the comment section below. That's all of today. मिलते हैं अगली वीडियो में, तब तक के लिए बाय बाय.